Hi guys, today I'm building a kit which I've been looking forward to for a long time, which is this Chernobyl fire truck with firefighters from ICM. This is the Soviet AC-40-137 fire truck, and it was basically the standard fire truck of the Soviet Union during this period. ICM have released this fire truck before separately, but with this bundle they have included a couple of things. We've got 4 firefighter figures for Chernobyl, and we've also got the decals to indicate that this is a fire truck from the Pripyat fire station. And of course, Pripyat is the town which was built for the workers of the Chernobyl power plant. And of course, the firefighters from there were the first responders to the Chernobyl accident. And as a result of that, many of these fire trucks can still be found inside the Chernobyl exclusion zone, where they were abandoned after the cleanup operations because they were simply too heavily contaminated. And another interesting inclusion in the box is this backdrop piece of card. In fact, this is one of the reasons the box is so big. So this artwork backdrop is designed to stand behind your model, and we can see the damaged reactor flaw there in the background. That should make for some interesting photo opportunities. I might make a simple base with some debris on the ground and so on to complement that. I haven't decided yet. If you haven't seen ICM instructions before, here they are. Personally, I find them a little bit cluttered, but not too bad. And we have a separate instruction sheet for those firefighters. One thing I did notice is that the box contained quite a few broken off pieces. I'm not sure if this is because the box was much bigger than the sprues so that it could accommodate that cardboard backdrop, or if it's because ICM like to put all of their sprues in one plastic bag and they tend to smash against each other. And you can see here with lots of fragile parts like the ladders, I guess the damage could have been quite a lot worse. This ladder here is damaged though, unfortunately. The construction starts with the chassis of the fire truck, and each part has very clear guidance holes and pins, so it's very easy to get everything nice and square. And one thing about this kit which is really nice is there's lots of detail, even in areas where you won't see it. So for example, these 2 tanks here which go in the middle of the chassis, there's no way you're going to see those, but they're there anyway. And you could say the same about the transmission and the drive shaft as well. Personally, I quite like that attention to detail. There's nice texture here on the stepping plates. The engine does have a lot of detail. I built it up initially, but then I didn't add some of the finer detail, simply because it just won't be seen. I suppose you could leave the bonnet piece loose, but I just decided to glue it down and not see the engine detail. So for example, I left off these belts and the fan. But I will show you a few shots now of the detail that is under the chassis, because I think it's worth noting. You can see here in the suspension, for example, the bolt head details. And I think generally that's just a good thing from these manufacturers. It shows a good attention to detail on their behalf, even when you might not see it. And as a modeler, I think it gives you more opportunities as well, more options. You could show this vehicle, for example, in a highly wrecked state with large pieces of the upper vehicle missing, and still have the confidence to know that most of the chassis is there. You wouldn't be revealing just a bare chassis. Equally, you could have perhaps a vehicle overturned and still know that the underside is not going to look blank. So I do think this is a very good touch from ICM. And here you can see the completed underside with all the detail. Moving on to the cab and the interior, ICM say the interior should be a light green colour, and then they give Tamiya XF5, which is not really a light green, so I decided to use a different colour there. ICM also say to paint the flaw black, but I decided to go light green of that as well. If you look at reference photos online, there are plenty of variations there in terms of the greens and where they're used. Some of the interiors are even a kind of grey colour. This piece here at the front of the cab was the only piece which I found difficult to fit in the entire kit. It's clearly supposed to go here like this, but it doesn't have anything to guide it. And the best you can do, I found, was to clip it to the adjacent floor to try and keep the floor level. I built the seats up for the interior, but I didn't put them in straight away because it would make it easier to paint them if I did it separately. And here you can see a dry fit of that interior. There are a couple of ejector pin marks on the rear. Most of those will be covered by the seating, and the ones that are not will be so close to the ceiling I don't think they'll be noticed. The sides of the cab attach nicely. It isn't possible to pose the doors open, these sides are just one entire piece each. I did consider cutting out one of the doors and trying to make it hinge open, but then I chickened out basically. Moving on to the rear of the fire truck, the water tank, which takes up most of that space, is a simple box with a kind of double wall. We do have to plan ahead a little bit here though, because this is a kind of water pump which goes in the rear compartment, but it's supposed to fit in this gap in the middle with those two arms going out each side. So of course that means you would need to put the pump in the middle before you build that box. But that does complicate the painting process quite a lot because the pump should be silver and the interior of the compartment should be a green colour. And the way I solved that problem is that I built the box up and I decided that I would paint the pump separately and then just cut off one of those arms so that the pump can actually get into the space. And that doesn't cause a huge problem because if you look at the way the pump fits in, the ends of those arms go between that double spaced wall, and at the end of those arms is a hatch which can be either closed or open. So I will close the hatch on the side where I cut the pump arm off, and I will leave it open on the side where I left it intact. There is a bit of a mistake in the instructions here, where there's a kind of, I guess an extension of the drive shaft or something that goes into the back of that pump, and ICM tell you to add it now, with the slight problem that it's supposed to go through that hole there, but both ends of the piece are too big to go through the hole. It's not a major issue, and to be quite honest, I didn't even bother cutting the piece and reattaching it. I simply left it off. Most of it runs under the vehicle and the rest of it goes behind the pump inside a small compartment. And here you can see that big hollow box which is the water tank. It's a shame that the tool containers on the side don't have any interior. It would be nice perhaps to have one of those doors open and have something inside them, but you can't really do that. I suppose you could cut them out and you could scratch build an interior if you wanted to. There's a bit of detail on the rear of the water tank, so we've got these steps here to get to the roof. We also have the option of making this little window open or closed. If you leave it open you can see that pump I talked about earlier, and therefore I decided to leave it open. There's a series of 4 pipes which go on the roof. I'm not quite sure what these are for. I haven't cleaned them up here, I'm just roughly fitting them. You do have to follow the instructions very carefully because the notches in the pipe line up with pins on the roof. And again, you have to read the instructions a couple of times just to make sure you've got that really clear. Moving on to painting, I kept the cab, the chassis and the water tank as 3 main sub-assemblies, separate for painting. I added a small amount of black pre-shading to the top of the water tank. I also put some green down in the compartment at the back of the vehicle, and some black pre-shading and some green in the cab as well. The cab then needed a few details painting, like the pedals and the door handles. They won't be seen easily, but it's worth doing them anyway. And now it's painted in silver, that water pump can go into the back there. I've cut off one of the arms, as I said, and it slides in nicely into position. And that missing arm on the right hand side won't matter because it won't be seen, as you can see. And on the left hand side there, that arm that is there will be the attachment point for the hose pipe. Next up was the white stripes. So I painted white on the doors and on the areas of the stripes. And once that had dried, I masked those off and painted the rest of the vehicle red. My masking wasn't perfect, unfortunately, which is a bit embarrassing considering it was a simple rectangle, and I did need to do a bit of touch-up on those, but I did get there in the end. The chassis was very easy, that was simply painted black, and then a bit of detail painting for the exhausts. So this is Vallejo Saddle Brown. And then to make it look like rust, I added a bit of orange and a bit of brown. And I did that while the paints were all still wet, so they blended in quite nicely. And here is the cab in position on the chassis. You can add the bonnet or the front grille until the cab is in position, because the cab slides in from the back of the chassis, and the grille and the bonnet would both prevent that from happening. And here are the seats. The dashboard and the red window frame did cause me a bit of trouble. It was like something was slightly misshapen, just ever so slightly out, and it took quite a lot of fiddling and a bit of pinning down with tape while I held those in position and glued them. And you can see initially here I had a bit of a gap between the top of the cab and the roof, and it did click into place, but it needs lots of practice in terms of dry fitting before you commit to glue. And then it needs a good old tin of Tamiya paint on top to hold it down while it glues. And there you can see the grille and the bonnet in place. One of the disadvantages of painting them separately is it's possible to get slightly different tones of red on them by giving them fewer or more coats. You can sort of slightly see that there between the window frame and the bonnet, but to be honest, I don't think that detracts from the model too much. It's easy to imagine these could be replaced parts, and once they're varnished and weathered they will blend together much better as well. And the water tank pops in nicely behind the cab. There are only 4 small attachment points for that, so I did put quite a lot of strong superglue on those to make sure it stayed in place. There are a few further parts to add to the bottom of the vehicle once the water tank is in place, and this spare wheel holder is one of them. Strangely, you can see there I found the arm that holds this wheel in place doesn't go vertically, it has to be bent slightly because of the thickness of the tyre, which is a bit odd, but in the end it went in fine. You can see there's also a final piece of the exhaust to put in place. At this stage I gave the cab a gloss coat and added the decals. I messed up slightly here, and this number 2 is a little bit too low on the door. These decals are very good, they're very thin, and they stick very well as well. So once this was on, I had it slightly rotated, and it was hard enough just to rotate it back by ½ degree. So there was no way I was going to move it a few mils higher without tearing the decal. So I decided to leave it in place. But they are very good decals, they don't stand out at all, extremely thin things. And once that cab roof is in place, you can then add the rooftop water cannon and those 4 pipes which also go on top of the roof. And a few other minor details like some rails and some sirens. There are quite a few clear parts on this kit, so I cut them off, cleaned them up and stuck them to some tape, and then painted them in the appropriate clear colours. Basically either clear blue, clear red or clear orange. I did this using PVA glue because that won't cause the clear parts to fog. And before I added these clear parts, I gave the whole model a matte varnish. You need to do that first because again the matte varnish will cause frosting or fogging on the clear parts. I didn't want to do a lot of chipping on this vehicle, but I did do a bit on the rails at the side. I used a combination of sponge chipping there, and when those chips were a bit too small I joined them together using some brush chipping. And I did some dry brushing of the aluminium on the anti-slip plates on the steps at the rear and the steps at the side of the cab. The tyres are very nice, but they do have a seam line down the centre, and it was very hard to sand those. So what I did instead was take a knife and a candle, heat the knife in the candle, and then gently try to melt and rub that seam line into the tyre. I got this idea from a website called the Modelling News, and it does a decent job of getting rid of that seam line. When you put the tyres on the wheels, you need to be wary of the direction because the tread goes in a forward pointing motion. As I say, I didn't want to weather this vehicle majorly, but I did want to add a small pin wash just to bring some details out. So I used some more of the shadow brown oil paint, thinned it down into a wash and applied it to the details. And as you can see, the wash flows nicely around those details. I added some of the wash to the wheels as well, even though they are painted black already. And you'll notice that I've actually done quite a messy job of this, so it did need quite a lot of cleanup, but that's easy enough to do with a brush dampened in enamel thinners, and you can carefully rework the excess and remove it. The only other weathering I wanted to do was a bit of dirt on the tyres and the underside, and I used some pigments to do that. I picked out this asphalt road dirt and this lighter European earth colour. I started by mixing the asphalt colour with some enamel thinners to make a kind of thin sludge, and I put that into the recesses on the tyres. It looks very dark now. It is very dark overall, but as it dries it becomes a bit more of a brown colour. And then, to avoid the sharp edge between the dried pigment and the rubber tyre, I did a bit of speckling with the pigments, and that worked okay, but what worked better was blending some dry pigments into it to soften that edge. And I found in the end that I didn't need that lighter European earth colour, that the asphalt was fine on its own. And finally, to weather those tyres, I dry brushed some German grey around the raised sections on the edge as a kind of highlight to make them stand out. And of course the bottom of the fire truck would also get dirty, so I used some dry pigments on the bottom there. But I kept them very much on the black chassis. I preferred to keep the upper vehicle in that nice clean red paint job. There are 4 figures included with this kit, and looking at the sprues, they're very nicely moulded and nicely detailed. They build together quite well. There's a tiny amount of filling which I did, and a small amount of sanding on those uniform seams there, but really nothing major at all. There's a nice variety of equipment that they have too. So 3 of the figures have this breathing apparatus on their back with a finely ribbed hose going to a breathing piece. And from what I can tell from reference pictures, these uniforms look like they are accurate. We can see the built-up figures here. I gave them a base coat of XF52 flat earth with a bit of XF57 buff to lighten the overall paint, and then I picked out the details by hand. These are mainly Vallejo acrylics because I find they brush really well. And here you can see a figure with the detail painting complete. I took some Abteilung 502 shadow brown oil paint, thinned it down with enamel thinners, and applied it to the figures as quite a heavy wash. I wanted to make these uniforms look pretty dirty. And then once that had dried, I used some light brown acrylic paint over the raised edges to give some highlights. And the other thing we get in the box is these pieces here. These represent the graphite control rod encasings from the nuclear reactor. So these pieces here would house the control rods in the reactor, And when reactor 4 exploded, they were ejected and landed around the reactor building. And of course, this was one of the signs to the first responders that the reactor core had been breached, because these things came straight from the core. They couldn't have got out there any other way. I did want to make a small display base to go with the vehicle, so I set about cutting various pieces of excess XPS foam into sort of concrete block pillar kind of structures. I do keep almost all of my XPS foam cut-offs of any size in a box, and they're useful for things like this. I mean, if you look at a piece like this, for example, it can only really become rubble. I made a few cuts and cracks in them using various devices, roughed the edges up a bit with a blade, took a few pieces of metal to make it look like reinforced concrete, and then I also had some of this styrene H-bar which I used as well. So I cut a piece of XPS foam to the right shape and put a wooden border around it, and I built up one end where a pile of rubble will be going. Then I mixed up some good old sculptor mould and applied it over the base. This mixture is perhaps about as dry as you can go with a sculptor mould. Really, it should have a bit more water in it, but it spreads out nicely. I made sure it went down the edges of the wood as well to help bond that. It didn't really matter if these steps here at the edge were a smooth pile or quite sharp steps, because they are supposed to be a man-made inorganic pile. They're piles of concrete and rubble and so on. If you find that you get the sculptor mould sticking to your hands, you can always dip your hands in some clean water and use that to smooth it out. And while the sculptor mould was still drying, I placed in it the rubble pieces I'd prepared. I started with the medium-sized ones, got those where I wanted them. Then I added a couple of the bigger pieces, and then I went back and filled the gaps with the smaller pieces. And I think one of the tricks here is to go in layers. You can see I've put some pieces down and then they've been obscured almost by future pieces, but that gives a much better impression of a pile of chaotic rubble rather than something that's been laid out by hand. And then I took those pieces of the graphite control rod sections, which came with the kit. I'd painted those black already, though there was no need to do that, and I put those into the sculptor mould. Once that was dry, and the sculptor mould, depending how thick it is, can dry in a few hours or a few days, I gave everything a coat of Tamiya grey primer, followed by some Citadel Chaos Black. You can't use the black directly because the propellants in the rattle can will melt the foam, and the Tamiya primer gives a bit of protection against that. And then it was a case of airbrushing on some Tamiya acrylics, and I used various greys to do that, sometimes adding a bit of white or a bit of black to the airbrush cup in the middle of painting to give some shade and variation. It doesn't matter too much if the colours are not quite confined to their individual pieces, but basically just breaking up the colour of the pile of rubble. Then I mixed up a few Vallejo paints, very thin, with water, and I used those as a wash on a few of the rubble pieces. And then I dry brushed the pile of rubble with some light grey colours to give some highlighting. And with that done, the base was complete. So let's look at the final result.
Припять, 3 и 4 блок горит крыша в результате аварии взрыва.
Давай. Так уже подтвердили?
подтвердили, авария там произошла у них. Это диспетчер Припяти сказала. Пожарная охрана. Алло, Иванков? Да. Значит, вы выезжаете в Припять? Алло? Да, я слышу. На атомную станцию выезжаете. Там 3-й, 4-й блок, горит крыша. Пожарная охрана. Алло, Полесская? Да. Вы, значит, выезжаете на атомную станцию, там горит крыша 3-го, 4-го блока.
Okay, there we go guys. That was the Chernobyl fire truck and firefighters from ICM in 1/35th scale. I personally thought this was a great kit. It was extremely detailed. I really like the subject matter. As far as I can tell, it's extremely accurate and very well detailed. Even things like the figures had great attention to detail on them. So I definitely recommend, if you have any interest in this era or this kind of vehicle, that you give this kit a go. With a couple of mistakes in the instructions and with the amount of sort of detail there is, this is probably not a great kit for beginners, but I think anyone who's built even just a few models will be able to make a good result from this. So guys, before I go, I would like to take a moment to say thank you very much for my Patreon supporters. Their names are on the screen right now, and your support makes a great deal of difference, guys, and it is greatly appreciated, so thank you very much. If you do want to join them, there is a link on the screen now and in the description below for details of how to join and the benefits of joining. As always, I have a couple of models in progress at the moment. I haven't decided which one is going to be my next video yet, but I think we might be looking at a captured tank. So until next time, thank you again for watching guys, and I hope to see you next time.